Okay. All right. So once again, thank you so much for having me, Champaign County Audubon. Thank you for that great introduction, Nate. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about Point Pleasant, the Point Pleasant wetland, and basically the cultural history, the natural history, ecological restoration projects, and then the ongoing management of the site out there. And as I just mentioned there, here's the agenda. So you're going to be seeing a lot of pictures of flowers and maps and some birds. So yeah, here we go. So for those of you who have never been out to Point Pleasant, it is, let me get the laser pointer. So it's at the Middle Fork River Forest Preserve, which is in the northeast corner of Champaign County. So here, this map kind of highlights all of Champaign County and then all of the various forest preserves and then the Kickapoo Rail Trail here. So zooming in a little bit further, here's the Middle Fork River Forest Preserve. The Middle Fork of the Vermilion River flows through this forest preserve. I didn't quite highlight the river here in this map, but the river does come right next to Point Pleasant, which is this 180 acre section in the southwest corner of the preserve. And here we'll zoom in all the way. So when I talk about Point Pleasant, I am talking about the wetland, but I'm also just talking about the 180 acres in its entirety.
You just muted, Peter.
All right, can you hear me now?
That was my fault. I apologize.
Okay, no worries. So yeah, as I was saying, I'm going to be talking about the wetland, but also the 180 acres in its entirety, which includes a lot of wet music prairie, upland prairie, some savanna, and Oak Hickory Forest on the eastern edge of the site. And then the river is kind of below the forest down in the floodplain here. And there is a nice, a little 2-mile recreational trail that goes through the site. Really great area for passive recreation, bird watching, hiking. There are very few spots in the county, from my experience, where you can actually go and stand in the middle of the prairie and it's almost seemingly endless, where it kind of almost comes right up to the edge of the horizon. Point Pleasant is one of these places where, yeah, I mean, you could look off into the distance and you just kind of get these sweeping vistas of the prairie. And if you're a big wildflower fan, I definitely suggest going anytime between June through August. It really just explodes with color. Here's a picture that my one of my staff members took out there this season. This was like a super bloom of swamp milkweed in one of the wetter pockets out there. So yeah, just a really cool place to explore. So I get questions all the time about where Point Pleasant got its name from. According to the historian Elizabeth Hanson, Point Pleasant was the name of a post office that was located at the corner of the property between 1853 and 1862. And that site is like kind of this little grove of trees here in the corner. And I did come across this document in our records from 1870, which talks about the Point Pleasant post office. And it does give the exact coordinates in the township and section. And when you look at the location of this post office, it was actually a little bit northeast of the Middle Fork River Forest Preserve. I'm not quite sure if the post office was where there is a record of it before and it got moved because wagon roads became obsolete, or if this is in fact where it was located the whole time. But needless to say, the name of the post office in these historical records is the Point Pleasant Post Office. So it kind of gets its name, you know, from something as far back as 1862. And so back in the late 1800s, this land was owned by the Dust family. They farmed this land, and there are historical accounts of there being a ford across the river right here where there was a coach way station on the Dust property, likely right here. And stagecoaches would come across the river. I've been in this area, in this kind of wooded area along the edge, and there are some areas, there are some roads that are kind of cut into the hill there. So my guess is that that ford was probably right down here where I have this circled in red. And then also just backing up a little bit, this aerial we're looking at is the earliest aerial photograph of Point Pleasant. It's from 1940. And I'm kind of zooming in here. And as you can see on the northeast section, there is definitely a man-made channel that was likely dug through here to drain the wetland, probably to remove the water and put this land into agricultural production. I don't have a date for this, but I know a lot of ditch and channel work in Champaign County was done in the early 1900s. So that was likely done around then. And this was essentially dug all the way to the Middle Fork River, which is over here on the right side of the screen. And then in 1964, a head wall was constructed at this side of the property to provide erosion control for the agricultural fields over on the west end of the wetland. So in 1974, land acquisition began to establish the Middle Fork River Forest Preserve. And part of that was purchasing a section of the Dust family farm, which is highlighted in red here on the right side of the screen. And this land, as you can see, all this land was in agriculture for the most part. And after the forest acquired this land, it remained in agriculture, and the district farmed it. So here we can see, this is another aerial, it's more current, but I just wanted to highlight that in 1984, a channel was actually dug through the middle of this wetland. And this was to expose lateral tile outlets to allow water to drain adjacent agricultural fields and then also the agricultural fields actually on this property. So you can really see how, they must have gotten heavy equipment in here to really dig a channel through this wetland and try to drain as much water out of the site and remove as much water as possible. And in 2000, with funding from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, the rest of the Dust family farm was purchased. And this included most of the wetland here. And we received funding for the purchase of this property on the condition that this be maintained as a conservation easement. So there were no structures were allowed to be built on this portion of the property. And then in 2010, with the help of a Illinois DNR grant for open space land acquisition and development, or OSLAD, property was purchased from the Weber family on this section on the southern side of Point Pleasant. And this, after this purchase, this actually kind of completed and defined the property lines of Point Pleasant as we know them today. So I just want to emphasize again how, since the 1800s, there was a lot of channels dug, tiles were dug, tile drains were put into the ground to move water, into this wetland. And there was a channel dug through the wetland, and then also the channel that connected the wetland to the Middle Fork River. So there, a lot of altered hydrology going on with this area. So kind of backing up now, focusing more on the natural history of Point Pleasant. This is the original land survey from 1822. And as you can see, the majority of the region was tallgrass prairie with some wooded groves kind of here and there. You see the Middle Fork River running down here, Sugar Creek, where it meets up with the Middle Fork River here. There's a pond in this survey, and Point Pleasant would have been right around here at the intersection of these sections of the township. And there are actually notes from the surveyor in 1822, and he described these sections as rolling rich prairie, which is interesting because, how why didn't he indicate that there was a wetland in the region? And it's likely the surveyor, he either didn't distinguish between wetland and prairie. Maybe it was during a dry time of year, there was no visible surface water. Before all this land was converted to agriculture and before the installation of agricultural tile drains, there were definitely more places for water to I guess, standing water to exist in other smaller pockets throughout the prairie. So it wasn't all just getting kind of channeled into this area. So it may not have been as inundated as it is today. And we can see, just looking at the elevation and topography, here's a heat map. We can definitely see an obvious basin kind of around the area. That's the wetland. And then we see a little smaller pocket wetland over here, and then some isolated areas of higher elevation that we call knobs. And it's probably likely that during the last glaciation that peaked about 18,000 years ago, that this is considered a kettle depression, and that this was formed by a big chunk of ice that came off the glacier. And then some of these more isolated areas of higher elevation would be kames then, formed by glacial outwash. And this is also supported by a soil survey that was done in the 1980s that shows the certain wetland sediments within these basins. There's loess in these higher areas kind of out in the prairie, which supported the notion that this was upland prairie. And then glacial outwash kind of in this area closer to the river. And it's likely that this would have been a kame formed by glacial activity, and it was likely more of a savanna. So this would have been somewhat forested over here. So in 1997, a group of scientists did some coring in the middle of the wetland and discovered that there was a layer of peat over 25 feet thick in the middle of the large basin. And peat, for those of you who don't know, peat is like partially decomposed organic matter, and it's kind of indicative of historic lake beds that essentially filled in with sediment over time. And so it's likely that this area was either a fen or a sedge meadow. And then just kind of, I put this table here so one can kind of see the differences between bogs, fens, sedge meadows, and emergent marshes, and how the soil types, the pH, water inputs, and water levels essentially define basically these ecosystems and really influence the kind of plant communities that grow in them. And so just based on the peat that was found in the large wetland and the fact that the soil was neutral to alkaline, it's likely that the area in that larger wetland was either a fen or a sedge meadow, and that was probably largely dependent. The difference between the two is probably largely dependent on how much the water levels fluctuated, which would have influenced what kind of plant communities grew out there. Or it could have been a combination of both as well. So knowing that this peat was out there, the district actually considered scraping the soil off of the surface of the peat that had accumulated from all of the agricultural runoff. And exposing that peat would have facilitated the growth of some, I guess, more conservative fen or bog plants. And in 2003, the Illinois Natural History Survey did a forest quality assessment of the site, and they also took cores of the peat and actually germinated what seeds existed within the seed bank to see what kind of species would actually germinate and grow if they expose the surface of the peat. And only about 9 different species germinated, and they were all pretty wetland generalist species that you'd find in any roadside ditch. bulrush, sandbar willow, black willow, arrow leaf, things that were relatively common. And because of this, they didn't recommend that the district proceed with scraping the soil off of the surface of the wetland, which would have ultimately just created more disturbance in the area. All right, so this map is actually a map that's found on one of the interpretive signs out on one of the trails at Point Pleasant. And this really shows how the different areas were planted and in what years they were planted and seeded. So I also kind of just made an update to this map just because some of these units were actually planted after the map was created and put on the sign out there. So for example, the tree planting here for this savanna and this prairie was planted in 2015. And then the prairie closest to the parking lot out there was planted in 2016. But you can see, for example, this unit here, the Weber property was planted in 2011, which would have been a year after this land was acquired. And then also there was seed thrown in these wetter areas in the wetland, in the shallow water wetland over here, and then the larger basin. So what was nice about these restorations, and I guess I should also mention, this was all done by natural resources staff before I even started here at the district. I started in 2017, so even the last planting was the year before I started. But all of this was in agriculture. The district had farmed this land or acquired it and then planted it right away. But all of this was in agriculture, which was actually great because of all the weed control that happened throughout the year. So there was very little weed seed within the seed bank in these units. And most of these were planted to wet mesic or upland tallgrass prairie. And then there was like a short stature prairie mix planted over in the savanna planting over here. And the tree planting over here was planted through direct seeding of nuts and then also container trees over here. But really cool how just all these different little subunits were planted at different times. And you can actually even notice some of the subtle differences between the plant communities just based on the how long ago they were planted. And most of these were planted with species mix between 80 and 100 species were planted in each of these. And a mix of collected seed and seed that was ordered from native plant nurseries was used. So here this is an old picture I found on the drive, and you can see all the dust in the air from all the chaff and stuff coming off of the seed and the dust in the middle fork shot. But these containers are all full of native seed. I think this seed was actually used to plant the Weber unit in 2011. And here we can see all the seed mixed together. And this was before it was all the seed was separated probably by species and then put out, mixed together, put back in these bins so they could be loaded into a broadcaster on the tractor. But this seed right here, you're probably looking at about fair market price for this native prairie seed probably would go for like $30,000 to $40,000. So pretty impressive. And here you can see a former natural resources staff member doing some broadcast frost seeding on the Weber site. Yeah, we used a broadcast spreader, or I should say they used a broadcast spreader. And we like to plant on snow so you can see where the seed is going. And so you're getting good coverage. And then as the snow melts, it actually helps the seed get into the soil, and that freeze thaw cycle helps with the cold stratification that promotes the germination of these plants. And then also a lot of work was put into these plantings post-planting. In early restorations, you got to do a lot of mowing, a lot of weed control early on, hand pulling, herbicide application, spot treatments. So just, a ton of work went into all these plantings and restorations. And here you can see this is a photo taken shortly after one of the plantings. And yeah, I mean, just an explosion of wildflowers, forbs and grasses growing up here. And for a while, the wetland water level was actually maintained by multiple beaver dams, some in the this artificial channel that was dug out probably in the early 1900s. And then some dams actually kind of farther up in the main wetland. And the damming got so bad in some years that it was actually causing the wetland to flood so much it was water was backing up into adjacent agricultural fields. And as one can imagine, we had some pretty angry neighbors back then when that wetland was flooding. And because of that, the beavers were ultimately trapped out of the area and relocated. I think that this happened in like 2013. But the district still wanted to maintain higher water levels within the wetland and also be able to regulate the water levels out there. And so fairly recently, in October of 2020, with the help of funding from the Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation, a artificial weir and water control structure was installed by a contractor on site. So we could increase the water level, and then we were able to regulate it. So this riprap was placed within the channel at a certain elevation. So during big flooding storm events, the water would overflow over this weir. And then there was also a riser pipe that drained the water with a stop log structure. So we could actually manipulate the water levels below this if we wanted to drain the wetland to get in there for management activities, for example. We now have the control to do that. And so this is the location that the weir was installed. As you can see, kind of right to the northeast of the main wetland up here. And as you can see by this image, I mean, we're getting back to those levels that we once saw when the beavers were out there. So it's essentially acting as an artificial beaver dam, but with more control. And even more recently, about a few weeks ago, actually, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they approached us, or I should say a couple months ago, they approached us. They had some extra money and were wondering if there were any wetland improvement projects that they could help us with. And site operations at Middle Fork gave them a few candidate sites, and they looked at this shallow water wetland and they really liked it. And a couple of weeks ago, they had a contractor come in there and essentially remove all the perforated drain tile from this wetland that was draining it, and replaced it with a non-perforated drain tile. And what that did is then that tile is still able to drain the adjacent agricultural field here. But because it's not perforated, this is able now to fill up independently and to hold water. And this work was completed like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And this is the location of that little shallow water wetland down here in the southwest corner of the property. And this picture, actually, the assistant site superintendent, Jacob Pruitt, actually just sent me this picture today after all the rain events we've had. And this, I think he took it from his drone up there, but you can see this wetland, this little shallow water wetland is holding water wonderfully now. And it kind of looks in the distance, you can see the larger basin. It doesn't look that wet. And that's because we currently have all the stop logs up, and we're trying to facilitate the draining of the wetland right now. We'll probably throw those back in and raise the water level over here, but we were working on unclogging the pipe because the beavers got in there, and we'll talk about that in a later slide. So this area, I would say even before we brought or had the weir constructed, has been, you know, a bird hotspot. We always schedule activities, projects to do up in Point Pleasant in mid-May when we have birdathon, just because we always have really great luck seeing all sorts of different species up there. I think our department counted roughly 80 bird species this past year, and a large number of them were sighted at Point Pleasant. And some notable wetland bird species we've seen include Sandhill crane, northern harrier, great egret, blue heron, wood duck, greater yellowlegs, blue-winged teal, Sora rail. And I haven't seen a king rail, but somebody told me that somebody thought they heard one up there. So I put a question mark next to that, but that would be pretty cool. So as I mentioned before, we've kind of been working, this riser pipe kept getting clogged by beavers. We actually unclogged it using a trash pump. And then we built this kind of large exclosure. We installed fencing around it to keep the beavers from getting in and clogging this up. We want the wetland to hold water. So the beavers were ultimately helping us, but we also want to be able to maintain control over the water levels. Engineers, they estimated that, you know, when everything was working correctly, when we pull out all the stop logs, we should be able to drain the wetland in like 3 days or something like that. So we want to have that control, but from, you know, right now, I think keeping all the stop logs in and maintaining high water levels in the wetland is the right move. We want to you know, maintain that bird, amphibian, and reptile habitat. And from like a climate change standpoint too, you know, all that peat is partially decomposed soil organic matter. And if we were to drain the water, it would actually bring more oxygen in the soil and would promote decomposition, and all that carbon would end up just going back into the atmosphere. So we want to keep that soil saturated. The only reason I would say for reducing the water level would be for certain management activities, including invasive plant species control. There was a big patch of Phragmites out there. We ended up spraying. There's been some pretty big stands of reed canary grass that it's impossible to get our UTVs and equipment and things like that down there. So draining the wetland would make sense from a management standpoint, getting into some of these areas. And then also some wetland plants, they actually require kind of bare soil to germinate and begin growing, and then they can be inundated again. So if we were to want to do plant species enrichment, we would probably manipulate the water levels to bring in some new seed, and then when they'd start growing, we fill her back up. And what would a presentation about ecological restoration be without prescribed fire? So fire is certainly an important management activity that we do out at Point Pleasant. It keeps the woody species at bay and maintains this kind of open wetland and grassland habitat, among many other benefits. And so I like these two pictures because this was actually taken kind of up on the ridge looking down by a ignition crew that was kind of waiting for us, and then they were going to light their flank up here. So they're looking down at us kind of in the depression down there. And then this picture is actually a picture of us down in this depression, and the other crew is like up in this corner, and it's almost as if people took pictures at the exact same time. So I like these two pictures. And then here's a cool video. I don't know if it's gonna play. Yeah, I'm not sure why these videos aren't playing. Well, anyways, this was a pretty cool head fire. And yeah, one of our techs was kind of bringing the head fire up, and I was standing on top of the UTV taking a video, and it got so hot in front of me that I had to stop the video. Otherwise, I wanted to get the whole ring of the unit burning up. And then I had another video of this really interesting smoke whirl when we burned the north side of Point Pleasant. Someone was lighting the head fire kind of over here, and I had the drone up, and I caught this out of the corner of my eye, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. But this was like a kind of a little mini tornado that was sucking up all the smoke and ash. So really interesting. And then here's a picture of North Point Pleasant shortly after, or I shouldn't say shortly after we burned it, but the season after we burned it, and you can just see a explosion of growth and color here. So I love this picture. So some of the key takeaways, I would say that Point Pleasant has a rich cultural history. Some of the old wagon trails and the post office out there, and then the old farmsteads. The wetland was likely a fen or a sedge meadow, but is now currently managed as a marsh just because it has a lot more water in it. And the water is probably much deeper than it used to be. And this is just because of the altered hydrology of the site and all the water that's, draining from adjacent agricultural fields. We can't break the tile that drains their fields legally. But it's still a great habitat, for birds, amphibians, and reptiles. And then I'd also say Point Pleasant is an ecological gem in Champaign County with over 150 acres of high quality restored wetland, grassland, and savanna habitat. So if you have not been to Point Pleasant, I highly recommend going. Any time of the year, even this time of the year when everything's brown, it's beautiful up there. But definitely make it up, sometime between June and August. And here's a cool picture too of some whooping cranes and sandhill cranes. And this was actually taken, I think, back when the beavers used to maintain the water levels out there. So hopefully, I don't know if the whooping cranes have been sighted out there recently, but fingers crossed they'll make their way back there. Any questions?
I have a question. Did you guys have cranes or some really interesting bird breeding out there for a while? And if so, is it still?
So there have been sandhill cranes that have consistently nested in what we call the Kettle Marsh wetland, which is at North Waterfowl area. So I'd have to go all the way back, but that's kind of more on the north side of the Middle Fork River Forest Reserve, just adjacent to the North Waterfowl Management Area, if you're familiar with the site.
So that's just been consistent with the last 4 or 5 years. That's it seems like I heard of it a while back.
Yeah, they've been coming. Yeah, since I've been here, they've been returning to the same site, and we even actually that whole area where they nested was due for a prescribed burn, and I'm pretty sure we burned up their nest a couple years ago, and they ended up coming back still to the same site and rebuilt their nest and everything.
Cool.
Is agricultural runoff and nutrients a problem in Point Pleasant?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say Point Pleasant acts almost as a filter, in that the vegetation and the plant community within the wetland probably absorbs a lot of those nutrients and filters a lot of that sediment before that water makes it to the river. There's definitely sedimentation that's happening, that's going over the peat layer, and that's, just historically happened. It will probably ultimately fill in that wetland. So yeah, hasn't been an issue yet, but it probably will be in the future.
It's an interesting question. Have you looked for nitrogen gradients between the wetland and the river to verify what you just said?
I have not. Nope, that would be a very interesting study.
You mentioned reed canary grass. Is that the main invasive that's coming down is that coming down the river from upstream? And are there other invasives that are being born that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't, so very rarely does the river flood enough to like backflow into Point Pleasant. So my guess is that the RCG probably came from somewhere else, probably a ditch upstream would be more likely. And yeah, I would say RCG is probably our biggest culprit out there. We're pretty good at managing some of the smaller, more isolated populations, but there are some big patches that we're trying to get a handle on. Cattail, we need to start doing more managing cattail populations out there. And then Lespedeza is kind of one of those emerging herbaceous legumes we found some isolated patches of Lespedeza out there that we're really keeping an eye on and combing through basically all of Point Pleasant every year to hit that before it gets established.
Peter, could you comment on the strategic long-range plan for managing the wetland? And is there any goal of expanding the land holdings?
Yeah, I would say land acquisition is always a goal. However, the money has to be there. It has to be from a donation or a grant or fundraising. And then we also, we can have the money, but we also have to have a willing seller as well. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole watershed that feeds into that wetland, I think in its entirety, it's like 800 acres or something. And absolutely, that would be the goal, to protect as much of that as possible and restore it back to prairie, and then, alter the hydrology and basically destroy the tiles. And I'm sure, we'd see kind of that wetland, like I said, go back to the historic water level fluctuations that historically occurred at the site. Just because we wouldn't have as much water just being channeled away from these adjacent lands. Absolutely.
Do they have a sense of when that lake that laid down the peat might have been there,
Oh, that would have been as the glaciers receded, it would have formed a glacial lake over 10,000 years ago. And then it takes a long time for vegetation to grow and ultimately fill in. And
so that's relatively recent in geological history though, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Has anyone cored the sediments to look at the vegetation changes over, let's say, the last 10,000 years?
I don't know if INHS did that when they took their samples for that germination test. I don't think they went particularly deep. I'd have to look back into that, but that would certainly be interesting as well. And I would imagine because it's such an oxygen deprived environment, what the seeds and pollen and things you could find in that peat, I'm sure would be pretty well preserved.
You mentioned the trail through the prairie. Which trail? What's the name of that trail?
I think it's just the Point Pleasant Trail. Oh yeah, it looks like Emily put in the chat Point Pleasant Trail and gives the address as well.
Oh, great, thanks.
Yeah, the address, just a word of caution, and this, for whatever reason, happens on a lot of our parking lots and some of our remote sites at the district. Some of the addresses you put in, it'll give you kind of roughly where they're the same road that the parking lot is on, but it won't line up exactly. So when you put the address in, just do satellite view and just make sure it's taking you to the correct parking lot.
I'll just throw in a quick comment. I've done some dragonfly surveys at Point Pleasant and been pleasantly surprised with the variety. There are 28 species I've found there, and really happy about that shallow water wetland, because a couple of years ago, that was a great, I found things there I didn't find anywhere else out there. And it was kind of, I think was maybe kind of dry last year because of maybe the problems with the fields. So I'm really happy it seems to be back online.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that little shallow depression, it has really great potential. So that'll be cool. Any other questions?
Thank you for tracing the history of the area. It was fascinating. I have not visited Point Pleasant, but plan to get there.
Yeah, I certainly encourage you to do so. And yeah, that's why ecological restoration is so cool, is because you have to, look at the land use history of a site to not only determine, what was historically there, but also to see what kind of things happen to the land and what kind of environmental stressors do we have to understand to, better guide our decision making and restoring it. All right, well, if there are no further questions, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for that awesome presentation. Even though she's not here, thanks again to Alita for organizing this, and to Sarah for taking over last minute to run everything. Again, yeah, absolutely, guys, get out and visit Point Pleasant. The chat has the GPS coordinates and the address. So write those down, copy those, go give it a visit. Once again, the field trip on Saturday to Jasper Pulaski. If you have any questions about that, feel free to send me an email. My email address is Nathan Pawazki. My last name is spelled right there under my video, at gmail.com. So send me an email, and I can help you with any questions you have on it. Thank you again, Peter, and you guys have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.